Okay, welcome everyone. This is the future of food under climate change. Very timely topic presented by the National Institute of Social Sciences. We've got our panelists assembled and our moderator, and we are ready to go. Let me just give you quickly some logistics on this. As you probably already know, you are on mute by default. Your videos are turned off as part of the audience members. However, you have the ability to submit questions to the panelists during the panel using the Q&A function, which should be in the menu functions on your Zoom screen. We are recording this panel, and the link will be made available to you and emailed to everyone within a few days after the conclusion of the event. This forum is sponsored by the National Institute of Social Sciences. We are a congressionally chartered, not-for-profit association. We like to put on these events to discuss vital societal issues. And we think this one fits the bill perfectly. So we're delighted that you're able to join us today. Today, we've got a terrific panel. Among all our panelists here, we have Eleanor Sterling, who is the Chief Conservation Scientist at the American Museum of Natural History. We've got Kyra Busch, who is on the steering committee for the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. Will Rosenzweig, who's the fellow at the Institute for Business and Social Impact at UC Berkeley, and Don Taylor, who's the founder and CEO of AmplifiedAg, Inc. And moderating this entire event will be my colleague, Vice President and fellow trustee, Angela Cason. So what I will do now is turn it over to you, Angela, and let you take it away.
Thank you, Fred. Appreciate it. And welcome, everybody. Really happy to have you all here. Panelists, if you will, unmute yourselves. And I hope there will be. Eleanor, I can't see you. Are you there, babe? There you are. Hello. All right, great. Eleanor, I'm going to pick on you first. And I'd like to start, if Fred would screen share for us the donut economic model. I want to give everybody a 40,000 foot view of what we're facing on a global biological scale. So if you would introduce us all to this model, Eleanor.
Sure. So this model is called the donut economic model. And it's not because we're hungry. It's a model that this graphic shows very well to summarize the 21st century challenge that we all face of meeting the needs of all people on Earth within the means of the planet. And it builds on an initial effort by a number of different people to understand what are called planetary boundaries. And those are shown here by the dark green outer boundary called the ecological ceiling. And those include Earth's life-supporting systems like a protective ozone layer, fertile soils, a stable climate. All those things contribute to an environment that is sustainable for humans. But a woman named Kate Raworth also came up with what she calls the inner border of that system, and that inner border is a social foundation, a sufficient social foundation that supports a just and equitable access to things like food, like healthcare, like a political voice. So a just, equitable, and sustainable world resides between those two boundaries and makes the form of a donut.
So we want the world to be more like a donut. I think that's a good goal for all of us. Thank you. One of the things that struck me in looking at this is in the upper quadrant, if you guys look at food and health, there seems to be, in terms of scarcity, there seems to be plenty of food, quote unquote, plenty being a very loose term, and that metric is in better shape than the shortfall for health. And I think one of the things that we need to be thinking about as we go forth here is we're not talking necessarily about food shortage, although that's part of it. We're talking about the kinds of foods that we're raising, that we're eating, and whether or not they can help sustain life. Eleanor, you want to weigh in on that before I let Will loose in the pen pal?
Sure. You know, it's partly you know, there are sufficient calories in the world right now to feed the people we have and more people into the future, but part of it is distribution. So where is that food located in terms of where there are people who need food? And then the other part, as you say, is what kind of food is available? Is it all one kind of nutrient and we're missing other kinds of nutrients? So That's a big issue, and thinking about what's healthy from a physical perspective, what kinds of different foods are available to meet the dietary needs of us as humans. But the other thing that thinking about a cheap food supply might not address is aspects of what I call multidimensional well-being. In addition to nutritional concerns, for instance, in the food arena, we might also consider, does our food system contribute to sovereignty? Can people grow and eat the food that they want?
There's a collective effort right now, particularly I think on campuses, to reframe the issue of what's traditionally been called food security or food access, related focus on nutrition security. So to really address this issue head on, and again, change the frame and the linguistic orientation to the challenge at hand.
And in addition to the academic framing of this, which is important, because linguistics always matter.
I would also say the activist community is very into this.
I wanted to bring you in, Will, on talking about the actual food systems. And Fred, if you would bring that up. Part of how we got here is something I think people need to think about, and why we are where we are, especially with the challenges that we have as we try and moderate and modulate some of our food systems. So do you want to talk about this?
Sure. Yeah, we talk about the food system, but there's actually many food systems. But the important thing to remember is that they include biological, agricultural, environmental, economic, and socio-cultural systems that are all intertwined in a very dynamic and complex and interdependent manner. And I have the pleasure of teaching a large popular course called Edible Education 101 that brings people who have sort of an interest, a passion, a curiosity about food, and they've probably heard, sprinkles of, oh, our food system is really connected to, personal health, public health, and of course, planetary health and sustainability. And I think for the younger generations, this is an opportunity to sort of feel empowered rather than helpless and disempowered. So this is a simplified map. If you Google food system or food system map, you can see dozens of different versions of this. But one thing to distinguish is that when you do that, you are also likely to see maps that describe a food supply chain, which is much more of a linear model that shows sort of how things get from soil to fork or farm to fork. And they delineate much more sort of literally the steps of who handles food at each step, but they leave out a lot of the more invisible issues that have to do with policies and subsidies and cultural preferences and regional preferences and the politicalization of food. I mean, food, for those of us that follow Marion Nestle's work, food is political. And at a time where politics are strained in the United States, we're seeing those same forces at play in our food systems.
I think we all follow Marion Nestle, and I really appreciate you bringing her up, because I've heard lots of TED Talks where I'm screaming at the screen and just going, "That's Marion's. You're just repeating what she said." She was really the Rachel Carson of this field in so many ways. But I know for my own, having worked in the field of grocery products and understanding what a hegemony that is, and that what is an $800 billion industry, and it's dominated by major players, Walmart, et cetera, on the delivery side. And then on the supply, if you will, the farm side, we have all of the issues of the aggregation of who owns the seed, which is another huge concern for us that we need to be thinking about. Like the fact that we might want to distribute the development of food supply is directly related to is in opposition to how those seeds are getting owned corporately and controlled.
Well,
Anybody?
right now the food system is just, it's not working for everyone. There's a lot of people that are obviously, there's a lot of inequity. It's built on a system of systemic racism that the United States is just starting to acknowledge again, after 50 years of sort of having the civil rights era quieted. I think it's alive and vibrant now, given the things that are happening in the world. But one thing is important to acknowledge is that the food system we have right now is doing exactly what it's designed to do. It's just designed to do it for a very limited group of powerful interests that have a real concentration of power. And we have some charts to illustrate that, and I'm sure others would like to.
Is there one you want to bring up? Fred has them.
Well, there, if you want to just, since we're talking about grocery stores, if you want to look at the map that shows the concentration of brands and brand ownership in the United States, that's a great place for eaters or consumers to start. Not this one, Fred.
Right. This is the major stores within, these are the major chains within the country. There used to be about over 800. I think there's been a lot of consolidation since then, but there are many regional chains, there are ethnic chains, but these are the major players. And you see what happens when you get something like Walmart with a 26% overall dominance of the food market, which influences everything about what's coming to us. It's like when Texas buys certain textbooks, that's what we're all going to use. So, but go to the next one that you wanted to talk about, I think was the brand. Right.
Yeah, this is, again, just to pay tribute to some of the people that have worked hard on this kind of mapping and research. Phil Howard at Michigan State University has done a lot of useful maps to show that in this universe, the majority of brands are owned by 6 or 7, major companies, and they have their own supply chains and distribution networks and incentives. And as I've worked with large companies, they generally, that are brand driven, they'll usually say something like, well, we just give people what they want. And that's how they justify the product offerings that they have. They're just trying to fulfill needs. What they don't often fess up to is the amount of engineering, like biological engineering, to get us hooked on the salt, sugar, fat that are in those products. And again, I think thanks to some of the, Netflix documentaries and that are floating around, and some of the books like by people like Michael Moss and others, we're starting to learn more about how many of these products are just engineered to be addictive. Also, this group of companies has been just ingenious in creating new meal occasions, like, and new stomach times of the day. So snacking was something that just didn't exist 50 years ago.
Right.
One really striking thing is I watched a documentary about Woodstock recently, and it was just very interesting to see the BMI of people. Like, people just were a different shape and form 50 years ago than they are now, and a lot of that's attributed to the industrialization of the food supply, and our move away from physical activity and not growing things ourselves anymore.
And adding to that, the only comment I would add to that is how much they spend in advertising to drive consumer demand. So all of a sudden, Snickers is a satisfying health snack full of peanuts. Good for you. A little crazy. So are you seeing within, now that we've depressed everybody, are you seeing, Will, are you seeing shifts away from this? Is there light?
Again, it's
Don, it's one of the lights at the end of the tunnel, but
it's uneven. I can tell you that the interest in this topic on college campuses has never been stronger. I happen to teach in a business school where historically people came to want to become a management consultant or an investment banker, and now they're really interested in starting new kinds of food companies. that heed to a different set of values. And they're looking at everything from nutrition to packaging to waste to and we're seeing this probably most dramatically in the plant-based food area, where venture capital has just flooded in the last years. I just read that like $22 billion was deployed in food and ag venture capital, and Don can talk a lot more about that. But I think that this is going to be a generational thing. And I think what I would just add is that we've only got a few years, maybe 2 decades, to really address climate change in a way that we don't have irreparable issues that just can never be fixed by human beings. And if I would point our audience to one other expert who's not with us today, I would say Noam Chomsky, who is an elder statesman, and at 92, I just listened to his interview with Ezra Klein last night, and he is eloquent both about how human beings have mental and linguistic capacities that to solve these problems, that we can do it, and the urgency, the scientific proof that we are in trouble and we need to get going. And that's why I think working with young people and empowering them with the tools and the skill sets and the ways of manifesting change in all sectors of food is really an important undertaking.
Kyra, I think of you as one of those pioneers in this move toward change, and you do a lot of work with the indigenous populations and looking at the kind of food cultures that they grew up with or passed down. Can you talk a little bit about what we're learning and why this is so important to us right now?
Yeah, thanks, Angela. And, thanks for this setup. I think it's something really important to think about is that every one of us is an expert in food. We may be bringing a different frame or a different cultural point of view to it, but I think one of the reasons it's so potent and it gives us a window into transformation and opportunity is that it's something that is meaningful to each of us. Food is our relationships to our parents, our families. It's celebration. It's how we gather. It's what binds us. It's families. It's culture. Most of us have a really powerful food memory or a food recipe, and we think of that a lot more before we think about the chain of the grocery store or even agriculture and its development. And that's maybe that allows us to have the problem. I think we'll put forward some really important charts. We have, 4 companies that control the seed system right now. Also the pesticides. They are looking to get more and more land. They have a vested interest in convincing people that the problem is hunger and the problem is populations. And, Angela, you hinted at, and in the chart that Eleanor showed, there's really real problem there with political instability that leads folks to migration, to loss of land, to loss of those connections to culture and community. And we see it again really powerfully in our food systems. Things like Aleppo pepper, as the conflict has escalated in Syria, we lose that product. And of course, that's an indicator of the tremendous trauma and violence and conflict that's going on the ground in Syria. Yeah. The inverse of that is that there's a lot of hope, and it's also starting with food. So you can look at some place like Vanuatu, a small island nation. One of my favorite examples is folks there have been doing disaster relief responses that are actually architecture and food festivals, which I think the first time you hear it doesn't make sense. And then you talk to folks and it makes complete sense. Mm-hmm. The typhoons are coming, sea levels are rising, and folks who are surviving there, it's because they're building with traditional methods. So just Cyclone Pam went through, I think, about 2016. There was one death, and it was from a piece of corrugated tin that blew off and hit someone in the head. So everyone was using traditional building methodologies. It was built to go down with the winds, and it stores underneath it root crops that were there and survived not only that storm, but throughout the year. So I think part of this is understanding that there's deep wisdom in how cultures and communities have set up their food systems to absorb shocks and change, to be in perpetuity and to evolve with these new challenges we're facing. And climate change, you know, it may be more visible on an island in a smaller system, but it's happening here. We have a shock like a pandemic that I would think of as a portal or an opening, and pretty much every example that any of us on this panel or in your life can think of is true. There were examples of revitalizing local food systems, of trade, of barter, of markets, of farmers here where I sit in California, bringing dairy products directly to food pantries so it wouldn't go bad. There were also examples of people thinking that they couldn't buy food directly from people, flocking to grocery stores. And so some of this is asking us to examine our own culture of food, how we put our money into our own economy around us, and how we can do not only as an individual, but what systems need to be built to have these livelihoods and these economies that center nutrition and nourishment, cultural practice, and give people dignity on every step of that ladder. And I'll just stop there.
No, it's all, I've got like 5 things I want to ask you about. One of the things, going back a minute, was I was looking at IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and they had 2 or 3 main points that they were making about and one of them that raised a question for me was they said they want to increase the benefits from market participation, about with bringing indigenous growers into the market. Is that westernizing something that should be left alone and left to the within the power of the people who are producing it? Or do you see that as a positive? Like, what are some of the pros and cons of that particular little issue?
That's a great question, and it's a really complicated question. At the risk of oversimplifying it,
Jump in, Eleanor. She's nodding. Go ahead, Kyra. Sorry.
We already live within 2 food systems. So there is this very successful industrialized model, and there's a very successful model where people are growing and exchanging, and it exists in the West and it exists outside of the West. So we have open air direct markets here. I think there's a farmer's market map. I know I grew up in a small town in Indiana that was very proud that we had the longest continually operating farmers market in the country at one point. And it is farmers bringing, in the heart of, you know, industrial corn and soy and ag fields, bringing crops to the downtown to sell it directly to people. That is also a model of food markets that are alive and well. So I think when we say market, it can obscure a lot of different things that are going on. The market can be an indigenous owned, controlled opportunity. It can be exchange, it can be barter. It can also be a direct supply food chain that is exploiting laborers, exploiting folks at every step of the way. So I think, you know, without knowing the exact report, there's actually a new report that came out just a few weeks ago called The Long Food Movement that takes a great look at all of this, what transformation would look like by 2040 in a very fast timeframe, including international development, which IFAD focuses on international food and agricultural development. And I think the question for me is about ownership and control. Are we building markets that consolidate benefit towards companies and keep people, communities, indigenous foodways, systems, and knowledge out or isolated or marginalized? Or are we creating systems that give land back, that give resources to folks to be able to innovate, to maybe disrupt in the positive sense the systems that we have, and create a transformative future that provides, you know, is rooted in justice really and nourishment for all people. So that's, I think, what I would say. You know, there's a lot to get into, but sometimes market is another one of those terms that can mean more than one thing. And so you can get people agreeing and you can have everyone saying yes, but they're meaning different things. So the devil's in the details.
Yes, as I segue to Don, I'm thinking of another one that's used a lot, which is local. Oh boy, doesn't that mean everything? When I looked today in my grocery store the other day, and the local raspberries were from Chile. Like, okay, local how? Well, it's from this planet. That's good. Don, I think of you as somebody who's really putting proof to the model of bringing fresh and local and trying to integrate that with the system much as we have it now, much as it faces us. Most of us in the US, we're buying at groceries, we're buying at those major chains. We may supplement through CSAs, we may supplement through farmers markets, but the bulk of our groceries are still coming from these sources. And you're kind of trying to bring those two worlds together. You want to talk a little bit about your mission and how you're saving us all?
Yeah, I think where I would start is with the food systems map. That is pretty much what's driving our mission. And I started this for the farmer. As I started to understand what was going on the planet several years ago, the plight of the farmer is one of our core issues. And when you look at the reasons why the farmers have the challenges that they have, a lot of it revolves around the donut and a lot of the environmental issues that we're seeing. So our strategy really has been to figure out how to localize the growing. So we build, you can see the farm behind me, we build vertical farms inside of shipping containers. And the reason behind that was to be able to deploy rapidly and to be able to deploy locally. So the vision has been since the beginning that these farms will be placed in regions of the world where we need access to safe food. And we made the statement at the beginning that there's not necessarily a food shortage, but there's not access to the right quality and types of food. So our view and position is that we're gonna place these farms as close to the point of consumption as possible. So that's, you look at the kind of the global macro strategy that we're operating on. And then if you bring it down to the more local retailer level, where you had a list of a lot of the retailers on that slide, and we deal with a lot of those. And what we're seeing is that there is at the boardroom level in these retailers a movement towards trying to source from local farmers. And a lot of that's being driven by the consumer. So the consumer's asking for it. There's also a lot of economical reasons why the retailers and wholesalers are looking to get a safer, locally grown product. And because of that, we're also seeing an extreme interest in actually putting these farms right at the distribution center. So we're seeing the understanding that if we can eliminate a leg of transportation, we can begin to lower carbon footprint. If we can eliminate the potential of food safety risks with product traveling 1,500 miles, that's creating a really interesting movement. And the interesting and challenging part of this is, and I think this is where we started to go to a little bit earlier, is that for a farmer to participate in the retail supply chain, there are expectations on volume and being able to operate at scale, which then of course puts a significant burden on farmers because it requires a lot of capital to do that. So, as part of our overarching strategy is really figuring out how to create that network of smaller farmers with a distributed set of farms that are connected through a supply chain so that they can be growing locally and that product can be delivered locally into the stores, at that micro retail level within the macro view of being able to do the same distribution model globally.
You're also providing for the store's benefit, you're providing a sort of experiential offering that they can show to their customers and say, look what we're doing, and you can come see it right there. And this is right how we're bringing all this and doing all this for you, which is what they need now that they're fighting e-commerce.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of that, and there's the education of the community and the consumer at large. It's over the past 5 years, it's really been amazing to me to see how much of a shift there's been. We've put farms at local schools. And it was a very interesting pilot that we ran where most of the schools here have Chick-fil-A in their cafeterias, and then they have a salad bar. Right. And the salad bar, once the kids knew that the product was being grown on their property, and many of them participated in the process of growing that, we saw like a 70% increase in the consumption of the product in sitting next to a Chick-fil-A fish sandwich, or chicken sandwich. So yeah, I think that that exposure starting with the kids, and we're also seeing a lot of kids who want to participate in agriculture, like Will mentioned, who are coming out of agriculture programs and don't have a lot of places to go. So, bringing a next generation technology is also resonating well with that community.
Yeah.
I was going to just add to Don's comments, a couple other signals to pay attention to are there's the beginnings of a movement in California around school-supported agriculture, actually to disintermediate the traditional supply chain and connect the food service providers at colleges and school districts directly with farmers. There's also been, during the pandemic, an incredible, unprecedented run on seeds. And we have something in California, the Organic Seed Alliance, with lots of very small kind of homespun businesses, but they have in 20, 30 years, they've never seen the demand rise so much for people to start growing their own fruits and vegetables. And again, these are not necessarily national trends. They're very uneven in terms of the number of people that are participating. But in my class this year, we really focused, we called it Seasons of Social and Racial Justice. And it's been incredible to see how different communities have all of a sudden become much more visible and engaged and included in a larger conversation. And that's been very heartening, I think, a real wake-up call to create a much more inclusive food system. And it goes really back to land, reparations, and who lost their land and who knew how to use the land in ways. And what we call regenerative agriculture now is really tied very much back to indigenous practices that are hundreds and hundreds of years old.
Eleanor, you have the thought about that. What are you thinking?
Well, I was thinking a little bit about what do people think of as the person who produces your food. So often in my introductory classes about food, I ask a couple of different questions, but one of them is, close your eyes and picture a farmer or a food producer, and then draw one and show it to us. And it's often a white farmer on a tractor, which really isn't how food is produced in so much of the world. And it also leaves out all of the fish-based food and things like that. So that I just agree with Will that as time has gone on, we're getting a much more diverse understanding of who contributes to the food that is brought to our table. That's still at some level the linear model that Will was talking about from ocean, water, or soil to our plate. But at least we're broadening, and even on that scale, we're broadening how people understand what it takes to get food to us in these corporate industrial systems.
Don, I want to go back to you for a second, because I love what you were saying about education, and I think it's really important. One thing that struck me as we're being encouraged to eat seasonally is I have no idea what the seasons are. Is your, I mean, broadly, sure, apples in the fall, got it. Is your method of farming helping extend those seasons? Is that one of the goals, to give us more variety on without all the carbon footprint? More locally, I guess?
We really don't have seasons. Inside of our farm, we'll turn 21 times or 16 times in the course of a year out of one plant site. So, and it's just, every 21 days we have product coming out. And as we expand into other product types, the same strategy would be true. And when you look at it from a commercial perspective, that gives the farmer a tremendous advantage as well to be able to deliver consistently. Because when you get down to the consumer looking for a particular product and the retailer looking to deliver a consistent product year round.
I think that would be important. You were talking about Chomsky, and the other person I think who's important to mention in this is Carlo Petrini, who started the slow food movement, but is also moving into sort of a larger picture, not just slow down and eat, but talking about the cultural connection to food. And I know, Eleanor, that's one of your big areas is culture and also language in food. Do you want to share some of your favorite stories from that category?
Yeah, I mean, first I wanted to also come back to something you and Will were starting to talk about, which is regenerative agriculture. And I'm not sure everybody knows what that is. And so I thought maybe step back thinking about what that is. lots of people have different ways of looking at what is regenerative agriculture. So I think there's no one definition, but if you take a step back and think in the broad sense, it's really about taking this holistic approach and working with nature instead of against it to produce your food. So it means that you're thinking about what's going into a particular crop or a particular production of food in one place, and then what's coming out of that, and then can what came out feed into something else. And so there's a suite of different circular systems within these regenerative farms that allows for nutrients and flow of resources from one place to the other, so that it ends up becoming really circular and regenerative. And so it tends to reduce pesticides or store-bought fertilizers, no weed pulling, no disturbing of the soil, planting what are called cover crops that are weedy looking plants like clover or hairy vetch, good name. And those help to limit real weeds, but they also eventually help to provide nutrients for the soil. So lots of different ways, mixing and matching essentially across a landscape to think about what nourishes the land.
So is a real weed one that competes with what you've planted versus one that nourishes what you planted? You used that term and I was like, what's a real weed?
What's a real weed? A weed is contextual.
Weed is a plant that a gardener feels is in the wrong place. But just to add to Eleanor's point is that I think what's interesting about the term regenerative agriculture is that it's intersecting directly with climate change. And there's a lot of amplification and promotion of the idea that if we can shift our agricultural practices substantially, both in the fields and probably more potently with industrial animal agriculture, that we can cut carbon emissions dramatically, and we may be able to sequester carbon back into the soil. The science on this is somewhat inconclusive, and there's a lot of debate about it. And as we learned just this week, now there's a big red meat conspiracy flowing around too, to remind us of how political all of these issues are. But I think just to add to Eleanor's point, I would say we have to be we people who are tuned in today, people that are really kind of intellectually curious, we have to be really rigorous about getting fact-based, evidence-based information out, and we have to call out misinformation, and we have to, in the same ways, we have to call out racism and inequity. We can't just be sort of passive, bystanders anymore. Just the urgency of the problems ahead of us really calls us all to action.
Kyra?
I'd like to just add, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'd just like to add too that I view the innovations and technologies. I'm a large proponent of the regenerative farming. I've done it. I believe it's the right answer for us in many cases. And I view the technology as giving us the ability to free up land and buy time to go through those processes and repair the planet in large part.
Kyra, what were you going to say?
Well, Will, I think your point is one that begs the question about power in the food system. And I think that's one that we need to always be asking ourselves. The terminology shifts and it changes, and it shifts and it changes quite rapidly, and in different parts of the world, there are different implications. And regenerative agriculture is one that is being used quite commonly today, and especially in the West. I think here in the US, it helps us understand the relationship to the land, to the soil in particular, and it leaves out some of the components that might be critical in other parts of the world, which have to do with social equity, which have to do with people's movements. And it probably leaves that out purposefully, or is just not yet grappling with how we do that. And one of the reasons why I think is that here in the US, less than 1% of our population are involved in agricultural food production, are termed as farmers. We can go to other parts of the world where it's closer to 60 or 70% of the population that's involved in that. So the kinds of solutions we need here to provide food for scale in our population, and the kinds of solutions you need in other parts of the world, you can take India, for example, where you're talking about close to 70% of the population that identifies as a food producer, are quite different. And it's often a question of rights versus a question of markets. And so, I think you hinted at that a little bit before, Angela, but how do we build and acknowledge the power of people to access land, to access seed, to control their land, to make their own culturally informed decisions, to have their own governance models, to build these food systems? And those are really powerful questions for us. And I would encourage, I think exactly, folks here are curious, they want to know, they want to look at it. I would encourage you to think about, we have very few silver bullets, solutions that actually work everywhere in all contexts, but we can always be asking the question of who's benefiting from this and who might not be included, and what is our own role and responsibility. Where can we help shift that power, or the power that we have to bring more folks in, to encourage more of an economy and more dignity in our own decisions that we're making about food. And I would also just say on that note, because each of us is making a decision every single day, and it's not only your personal decision that's going to shift this, it does need to be a transformation of economy and of policy.
And it's not just rights, right? That's a hugely important piece. But as you were just saying, it's also responsibility. So Angela, what I was hoping to get to, which we wandered through and came back to, which is awesome, is in many of the places of the world where I work, people think about land and spaces and places and the places where food comes from as their kin, as part of them, as part of their network. And so they have a right to use the resources, but they have a responsibility to care for that space and that place. And so for instance, we did this cookbook with a community in Solomon Islands, where we were working on some of the issues of food access, food nutrition, and really concerned about some of the trends in adults, in particular in some of these spaces and places. But one of the things that the mothers were saying is that their children don't know the recipes from their mothers. Their favorite recipes aren't getting passed on. So we thought, well, let's think about doing a cookbook so we can share these ideas and information. And so a suite of women from across multiple communities got together to say, okay, what do we want to share with our kids and maybe with the rest of the world about what our favorite recipes are? And they started with an explanation of place. They started with, where do you get your food from? How do you grow the best clams? Where do you find these kinds of resources? So it wasn't just, take your resource, put it in a pot, stir, add some salt, and then serve it. It was really going deep and thinking about what can we do to nurture place and space, to have the food, to have the ingredients, to then be able to make a recipe. So for them, that was at all.
I love it. And there's some it reminds me of a producer, Muti is a tomato producer in Italy, and they're above Umbria. I've forgotten the name of the region, but anyway, they work with the local farmers, and every year they have, if any farmer doesn't come up to grade, like if they don't buy their tomatoes, they will go work with that farmer and show him, this is how you get to what we're looking for. This is how you produce the product that we're looking for. This is how you come up to our standards. So they're working in partnership with them, which I think is an interesting model for them. Don, did you want to say something? You looked like you were about to say something.
No, I think I was just shifting in my seat.
Oh, okay. Will?
One of the things that this conversation just brings to light is how much information there is about food, how much interest, and how voluminous it is. And I think one of the things I see in my classes is people just getting overwhelmed, because you can move from the plate in front of you and talking about, what could I do tomorrow to waste less food? What could I do to eat more locally? How could I eat more plants and less industrial produced foods? All the way to all the different systems that we're talking about, and all the different issues, whether they be global or locally in different spots. And I just always come back to, I completely agree with Kyra that, we have to be thinking about system solutions. We have to be moving different levers on that systems map in concert in a coordinated way. So we need to get better as human beings at collaborating and coordinating, in being sort of in entrepreneurial transformative networks, and working together. And at the same time, I think just to keep our wits about us, we have to think that a lot of little actions every day can add up to make a big difference. And one of the exercises we do in the class when we start the semester is we calculate the total number of estimated meals that this cohort of students, 200 students in an auditorium or in a Zoom room, are going to consume in their lifetime, and it's 80 million meals. And when you think about making small changes to 80 million meals, you could have an impact. So I think we have to figure out, as kind of educators or thought leaders or influencers, whatever we're doing, like how to bring these very large, complex system ideas down to bite-size action.
Very good. Well done. The other player that we don't really have in this discussion is the role of restaurants and restaurateurs. And I think that there are a lot of chefs now who are working very hard on localized ingredients. There's some that are working with indigenous ingredients. There's in the Dakotas, but they're also the first people who can make kale delicious, so that we go, oh, it isn't horrible and chewy and endless and gross. Maybe I can make this at home if I can replicate what this person does, because really we're not going to get change until Don's crop behind him is as tempting to a kid as the Captain Crunch that Eleanor got to eat once a year when she was little. I mean, there is that salt, fat, sugar conundrum that we're all raised on, and we have to think about changing ourselves physically and changing what we crave.
That's a great point. We did have, we had open houses at the farm, at the school, and chefs volunteered to turn the product into something that was very attractive to the kids. It definitely helped.
Yeah.
I think there is the salt, fat, sugar, and there's also the relationship. I've heard it said that kids need, and I'm sure it's true for adults, need to try something 7 times before they know it. And I think the way that things are introduced, that's why there's the power and the potency of your traditional knowledge and your traditional recipes. You've had it since you were a child and you know it. And each of us learning a new food can be scary. We probably, I can imagine that some of us probably have had the experience of, say, trying sushi for the first time. It was introduced to the Americas, or you watched somebody who said raw fish, and then they tried it the first time and they couldn't taste it because they were confused. And they tried it again and they loved it. And that's the same, sushi for somebody who doesn't come from that tradition feels like that. For each of us, we're coming from some tradition and not from another tradition, and we have to bridge those barriers. I think that's where the school programs can be so powerful, because to Will's earlier point, the food industry here in the US has done a great job of familiarizing children from a young age with processed foods, with salts, fats, and sugars, and we have to reintroduce a variety of foods. And that being said, I think, there are some amazing examples of this being done locally. One of my favorite, Navajo Nation, sovereign indigenous territory, passed a junk food tax, which is actually the Navajo Nation Healthy Communities Eating Act, I believe. And so it charges a small extra cent percentage on any purchase of a soda or a chip that you might buy in the gas stations and the grocery stores that are located on sovereign territories of Dene Nation.
Which goes directly to the kidney dialysis center on that.
Well, then it gets redistributed. So each community gets to decide how they're going to do it. So they've used it for Zumba classes. They've used it for greenhouses. They've used it for all sorts of wellness programs that folks get to decide what they want to do and how they want to do it. And that's an example, I think. We see now a model in Berkeley that was based off of that. And hopefully we'll see them in more places, which is, we have these local agencies and we can put our values in our food systems and figure out how we build wellness that works economically and that works for people's health.
Yeah. I'm gonna see, Fred, how am I doing on time?
You're doing great. We've got about 40 minutes left in the program, so
good.
We're good. If you want to approach some other topics, I would go ahead and do that.
I did want to kind of get into, because we talked about the future. Thank you. Because I didn't, if people have questions, I don't want to leave that out. I want to leave time for that. But one of the things that, and I posed this to Eleanor and she kind of rejected it last time, but maybe I can give it another go, was how do we need to think about and change our definition of what we consider edible? What do we need to do to think about? And this is, I'm sorry, I read sci-fi, I'm reading a series of books and everything that they're eating is made from yeast or algae, but it's reconstituted to look like regular food. Or if you think about, some of the concepts there, that we're going to have to take basic, highly replicable elements or whatever you want to call them and make them edible for ourselves. Can you speak to that sort of the inventions of food and the sort of adaptations to new ideas about food that we may be facing?
I'm going to start by riffing off of something Kyra said, which is it takes a while to adjust. So it isn't just technologically can we generate that, can it be available, but it's also will people eat it and will people see it as food? And so one of my favorite things to do in my introductory food class is to put up on the screen a picture of a shrimp kebab. It's like beautiful, lush pieces of shrimp along this thing over a barbecue. And I say, would you eat this? And most of the room who are not vegetarians are like, me, I would eat that. And then I put up a very similar picture and I say, these fatter versions are actually wood-boring beetle grubs. Would you eat this? And the entire room says no. Well, thankfully, usually 2 or 3 are like, I would eat that. But they're and most of the room says no. Now, hello, tell me what the difference is between. They're both full of lots of nutrients. They both probably are pretty tasty. But because in our mind we don't eat beetle grubs, but we do eat shrimp, that's food for us. So it really gets at the basis of what is food. And I think that some of these lower on the food chain type things that are made out of algae or made out of microbes or made out of things that people are not used to thinking of as common food sources can be challenging psychologically to get people to eat. That being said, there's huge sets of technology out there to try to recreate tastes with easy to manufacture foods, or foods that can be produced in bulk in a much smaller space than, say, beef or some of the larger meat products that meat the animals that we eat. So there's a lot of work out there on that. That's a huge and budding industry. I bet Will knows way more about that. I mean, I think it's really what he was talking about at the very beginning, these entrepreneurial young folks thinking about ways to produce new types of food.
Well, the cardinal rule in food entrepreneurship is that you've got to be driven by deliciousness. And a lot of technologists get a little bit off track thinking that if they create something new, whiz bang, that if they build it, people will eat it or people will come. And we learn over and over again that if it's not delicious, it won't, it's not familiar enough to kind of Kyra's and Eleanor's points that there's a cultural and there's a biological familiarity that we develop. And last night in my class, we had the pleasure of having the famous musician Questlove, who's the music director of The Tonight Show. And he's also, created something called Questlove's Philly cheesesteak with Impossible Foods 2.0. I don't mean for that to be a plug, and he's very low key about it, but he was very candid and honest and said, he had heard about this, and for his own kind of health issues in his tribe and community, again, trying to change behaviors from childhood. Like this is, he grew up in Philly and we ate a lot of Philly cheesesteaks. And boy, when you get to age 50, you realize like that can take, a toll on your health. So when he heard that there was an alternative, but what he talked a lot about that intrigued me was, he said it was the familiarity, the fact that this meat, or this plant-based meat-like food, which is being called meat, which is a whole nother topic we can go into about what we call products. He said, look, it smelled like meat, it cooked like meat, it looked like meat. And, when it was on that roll and slathered in all the things that are on a Chili's cheesesteak, it was indistinguishable or better. And, you know, it has positive climate and health benefits. We hope, we're not so sure about the health yet, but certainly it looks like on the climate front, there's some real benefit there. But I thought that was just a really interesting story. You know, it wasn't somebody that really considers themselves like a cutting edge foodie or, socially or politically correct. It was just, it's a confluence, and now he's waded into it in hopes of influencing and persuading a group of people and bringing a group of people to the table who otherwise this wouldn't be on their, on their menu.
And plant-based foods went up, I think, 23% in the grocery chain overall. Their shares risen hugely. But that again is a big category, which includes things like oat milk and almond milk and all those kind of things. And then you go, oh wait, but almonds are bad for the environment, so I'm not helping. That becomes part of a conundrum.
Well, just to chime in on that, I mean, I think one of the things this calls on us to start to think about is something that's called life cycle analysis. Resource analysis. There's again a lot of vested interests in the food system, a lot of power at stake, a lot of profits at stake, and there are truly really organized efforts to either confuse, confound, or provide misinformation. And I think this is why I like the work that Eleanor's doing and Kyra's doing and Don as well, is just to really promote evidence-based, trustful information. I'm always telling entrepreneurs, don't push the narrative too hard, too soon, because it's going to come back to bite you. Like stay in a credible place with your claims. Don't get too pedantic about everything and missionary. Just take that middle long-term course, and hopefully people will come to it.
Yeah, I would just like to add onto that real quick, Will. I couldn't agree with you more. We operated for almost 5 years before we did a press release, this is really one of the first things that I've done for that very reason, to get to that point. And the other thing I wanted to add is just the indoor growing community at large needs to understand and figure out how to grow crops from a cultural acceptance perspective. We're all starting with lettuce because it's the thing that's the easiest to grow indoors, but it's the first step in stabilizing the technology. But very quickly understanding the demands around the world based on expectations, what is a particular community going to consume versus not going to consume. And I see that as really the next large challenge for our space from a technology perspective.
Yeah, Don, I think, the question that Angela's raising, one of the questions we have to ask about the future of food is for what purpose and what are we trying to solve for? I think there's some really real questions about water usage, about land availability, about control, and about access. And I know, Don, you interface with that every day when you're trying to grow plants and figure out how do we use less water than we might in a different environment. And that's real globally, thinking about if we return to our circle, we have limited biological resources and we're trying to work within them in a context of a changing climate. Yep. And there are social questions that go along with that too. So we're going back and forth between these different poles, because one of the questions that I would want to ask about algae and yeast and all of these innovations, they're going to bring some benefits, and those are great. And how do those benefits weigh back against the social cost? Are we just putting those back in the pots of the same 4, 6, 10 companies, which leaves, in my mind, off the table all of the brilliance of human innovation? We're brilliant as humans at adapting and at changing, and we want to, I like to use the Wikipedia model. The more people you open up this up to, the better proliferation of information and of solutions and innovation you get, and the more likely it is to be adapted to the context at hand. And the other question about the future of food, I think there's the innovations that take in mind our climate restrictions and are working with that in mind. And there's the ones that help us return to things that have been left off the table by this consolidation of the past 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And I just am thinking about walking the streets with some indigenous Thai farmers in San Francisco, and they looked down and, you know, there's some change, there's quarters and nickels and dimes that they were finding on the sidewalk everywhere. And they would stop and they'd pick up a coin and they'd pick up the plant and they'd say, this has to be the only city in the world where you have food and money growing on the sidewalks, because in the cracks of the sidewalks is purslane, which you could go to a farmer's market and pay $5 a bundle for, or you could literally see growing in the sidewalks, but we don't recognize it in that form. And so I think there's just food all around us, and these ways that if we return to that knowledge and that relationship that Don, you're talking about in schools, Will, you're talking about, Eleanor, you're talking about, it opens up a lot of worlds for us, and each of us can be a part of this innovation. And we don't have to wait for, you know, one or two companies to come up with a single solution, because, you know, for my money's worth, that's rarely the best way to get towards large scale change.
I think one of the challenges of this conversation is that the US is very different from the rest of the world in so many respects, in terms of food distribution, in terms of our habits and our eating, and we've infected the rest of the world with our hamburgers and all those kind of things. One of the questions that came up, Nadina asked this question in the Q&A about the new foods such as Beyond Meat falling into the trap of salt and sugar to make things taste good. I have to say that for preparation for this, I had my first Impossible burger. And what I found about it was the texture was right, the taste was okay. What's impossible is that how could I be burping a hamburger 2 hours after I ate it? So it's like very strange. And my son requested edible crickets for Christmas, and when I bought them online for him, they came in flavors like barbecue. And I kept thinking that how strange it is that to someone who grows up eating crickets, that would be a very odd food combination to put together.
Angela, your experience with the burger brings up another big issue that we think about a lot, which is transparency, you know, in ingredients and labeling and sourcing and origin. And, you know, again, that concentration of power we're talking about translates into a lot of lobbying, which, you know, basically convolutes a lot of information. And, you know, while we have new products that are apparently plant-based, we don't really know what's exactly in them or what the full composition is. The way products are labeled either on the shelf or in some cases in restaurants, they're not labeled
Right.
at all, mandatorily in many places. And again, I'm talking about the US right now, but you know, I think one of the things that we have to keep asking for as eaters or consumers is greater transparency. We should know what solvents are being used, what intangible outputs are being put back into the environment through a process, whether it's fermentation or so. The other thing I was going to add is you know, as we look to go faster to address problems, and anywhere there's venture capital, large amounts of venture capital, and some of these companies have raised just unprecedented amounts of capital for their proof of concept, to tell you the truth. And wherever there's a lot of venture capital, even if it comes from really wealthy, philanthropic, altruistic looking people or their family office, there's an expectation about a return and on that investment. And that drives, unfortunately, because of the kind of extreme capitalistic world we live in right now, pretty short-term thinking, you know. So, you know, I worry about that this will end up being that, you know, the 4 gigantic meat companies in the world will end up owning all of the alternative meat companies in the world, to Kyra's point, you know, like,
you know, Will, you ran a major food company. You started Republic of Tea, you started that. So you know about
far from major. I would call that artisanal.
Yeah, so. You know about turn, and if you don't have enough turn on the shelf, then the store's not going to keep you, and that you have to buy in the slotting fees and all of that part of it, which is part of that huge system.
Yeah, but I would say entrepreneurs are here to defy those systems, and we never paid a slotting fee. We never, you know, when we started, we had such a unique product that had such shelf appeal that we were able to sell it direct to the stores. They didn't say go to
Yeah.
You know, they didn't go to a distributor. Now all the distributors are consolidated. There's basically only 2 ways to get to the shelf. But lo and behold, like 2 weeks ago, we had an entrepreneur in my class who started a company called Pod Foods, which is explicitly working with small artisanal companies to help them get back onto the, you know, the shelf. So there's a lot of ingenuity, and I think what we try to do, and you know, we are in a rarefied environment, being in the Bay Area. We have, you know, really, you know, interesting ecosystem and climate and cultural orientation to food, and, you know, luminary kind of change makers in culinary and farming. But you know, these are trends that I'm hopeful with, you know, where appropriate, they will, you know, spread quickly.
One of our attendees, Laura, asked the question about transparency and how can we create more trust. And I have to say that today I watched a television commercial for Whole Foods that talked about their beef and described it as vegetable fed. And I almost pulled the television off the wall and crushed it, because of course that means corn. And I just thought, this is the problem. People like me who are in marketing who come up with these ways to make it seem as if we're talking about grass fed, but we're not. You know, I mean, corn is corn the great evil? I don't know. Maybe it is.
Angela, maybe that may be a nice segue between that question and one of the questions here about the consequences of climate change in agriculture, because you know, I think in meat we hear so much about meat is the problem, and I would say that it is a particular kind of meat production that's problematic. It is one that is growing a lot of grains, using a lot of arable land in an industrial fashion, putting heavy inputs back into the soil, and then using those corn, wheat, soys, those cereal crops to feed beef. Those systems, and not only in the US, also in Brazil, they're often taking more and more land in order to produce in this mechanism. That one, I think we can generally agree, is bad for the environment on every level. It is cutting down original ecosystems. It's putting chemicals into the earth and soil. It's using these resources in like the worst possible way in the food chain calorically, and then getting, you know, nutrient content that's really expensive, and methane from cows and the way that they're produced. On the flip side,
political imbalance because of where the farms are, and
huge political imbalance, lots of environmental health consequences, especially when you move to confined animal feeding operations. And I would say that one of the things to remember is that, you know, the meat isn't bad. It's the process that's being produced, because we can also look at that exact same question. We can look at a lot of desert ecosystems, more grasslands, where animal production is the exact best kind of production for that environment. So you can look at a lot of the Sahel, and where there are pastoralist traditions, grazers around the world, in Kenya, in Mongolia, their grassland traditions are revitalizing that environment. They act as carbon sinks, if you will. They're cultural, and it's the right meat source, and it's a local production market. So it's closing a loop. And I think what we're seeing now is that agriculture is a big driver of emissions. You know, there's really, really varied estimates. Most of the ones that I've seen are around 20 to 30%, but it's also a huge part of the system. This transition that we've been hinting at towards these other ways, towards biodiverse systems, towards dense systems, towards ones that are not monocultural, has a tendency to produce a lot more food and a lot less land. So it's part of that transition back. Not only will it feed people, it will solve, it will be, I don't want to say solve, it will ameliorate some of the carbon crisis and emissions we're facing now in that transition. But the caveat is it takes work, you know, It needs constructs, it needs financing, and it needs different financing than we have right now. I'm sure Don can talk about exactly what is needed for his particular operation, but moving from, you know, the large scale plantations, if you will, of cereal crops to biodiverse farms that don't look like a person on a tractor, but some of us can't even see right now. It's a return to the jungles that you see other parts of the world that are actually full of food, and that takes a lot of transition space.
Yes, and one of the first points you made was talking about cheap food is what we're sold on. So can we get to a point where we can produce enough for people that certain industries have a vested interest in making us feel like food scarcity is a bigger issue than possibly it is. Maybe we're not all going to pick a dandelion out of the sidewalk and live on it, but is that something that we can dispel? Can we feed the world with these systems if we were able to adapt to them?
We 100% can. And in fact, one of the big questions right now, a third of the world produced globally is wasted. There's really different reasons for that in different economies. Here, it may come from restaurants or from excess buying and purchasing. In other parts of the world, it's due to lack of refrigeration and distribution and storage. But I think it's really important to start with this, that we actually do have enough. And, the planet has limits, but having a limit, it's like having a budget. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to spend any money. It means somebody's giving you a clear structure of what you can work within, and we have to find that balance. I don't know if I can answer the question of if we will, but that's my answer. And I don't know, Don and Will and Eleanor may say something different.
Well, Don is saying yes.
Well, yeah, I agree, but I would put the caveat on it too, that we do have to do it while we're figuring out how not to destroy the planet as well. And that's, in there lies the major challenge. And I do think that the distributed model of getting back to a point where a village can have functioning farms that are producing a consistent, safe, healthy food year round is, in my view, is a huge part of the objective, while not depleting the land, while freeing up land as well for that regenerative process to really bring it all back to life.
Eleanor, what were you?
Well, if I may, I mean, just following on Kyra's comment and yours, Don, as well, I think I've just got an elaboration just to complicate the picture, which is already a complex picture, which you've framed very well. But over the long-term change, right? I think we can all acknowledge that climate change is inevitable. It's happening. There's very little we can do to stop it. Maybe we can slow it down or ameliorate it and so forth. But we're already seeing evidence. I mean, my favorite little factoid I learned just the other week was that New York is now classified as a subtropical zone, that our winters and our summers have gotten warm enough over the last 5 years that we're no longer a humid continental zone. We're actually a subtropical zone in New York City. From what I understand, the thermoclines are marching up the continents, that in fact, the breadbasket of the Midwest will now be the breadbasket of Canada in 50 or 60 years. And that vast parts of growing areas that we currently use for maybe this industrialized food are going to look very much like deserts. And so this is all happening at a gradual pace, but clearly it's going to stress us out and have us to deal with a lot of these big problems in the context of these other issues that we're trying to deal with in terms of equity and justice and feeding the world, not wasting food. I just like to solicit thoughts from all of you because you think about these things as to what you think the solutions are or how we should address those problems.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in too. I think that my answer responds to something that Kyra said and then also what you just asked. And Kyra said back to a system. And I think I want to just be clarifying because other people I speak to when I talk about Indigenous knowledge and ways of being and different ways of being, think, well, does this mean we can't drive a car and we're not allowed to have ice cream because Indigenous people didn't have freezers? And what I really like is this idea of innovation based on tradition or innovation based on what we've learned through centuries. And I think that we need to be doing that innovation based on tradition in regional distributed modes. I think this idea that bigger is better, growth is the best, is what's harming us. And I think, Fred, that one of the most important things we can do is to rethink about what does it mean to be local with food. That was something Angela brought up at the very beginning. It doesn't necessarily mean that your food doesn't come from Chile. It does mean that you have a wealth of food around you that's grown, that's in concert with the nature of that place. As these environments change, try to think about what can you grow here. You probably aren't going to be able to grow the same things that you used to be able to grow, but if you have a portfolio of foods that are grown in an area, something's going to do better and some things aren't, and just being flexible and being able to quickly adjust as things are changing, I think is going to be one very key issue. And earlier, I think Will was talking about hubs. And I think those food hubs and those, we can replicate some of the good things about large scale by having medium and small scale coming together and working together in collaboratives and in hubs. And so you can address some of the major transportation problems, or have a roving unit that goes from farm to farm and does some of the things that need to be done, and smaller the farms that no single small farm can afford. So I'm a huge fan of thinking about distributed hubs and collaborative work and regenerative systems for the future.
Those terms are used in a lot of other fields. So it's interesting that these ideas of distribution, and also I think of a refiguring of what's important to us as we begin, especially in this past year, to question everything that we thought was absolutely vital, like the health of our quarterly return.
Yeah, and in the technology, I came out of the software world, and 20 years ago, we were figuring out how to put everything in one big space. And then 15 years later, we're trying to figure out how to break it into smaller distributed environments, right? And that's what really drove me down the path with the farming. Is I couldn't agree more. I think that the smaller, more distributed you can make a farm, regardless of how you're deploying it, the more you're mitigating risk, and the more you're creating a local supply chain with locally safe product.
Yeah. And we talk about distributed power the same way. The more systems we have for creating energy, the less dependent we are on the failure of any one system.
Yep.
So are you blockchaining lettuce, Don? Is that what you're telling us?
We could.
Sourcing is again becoming important to people, and being able to look behind you and go, my lettuce came from that one.
Yeah, well, traceability, yeah, actually a joke, but yes, traceability is a hugely important part. And from a distributed environment, it makes it a lot easier too. It's one of the challenges we see in these macro, massive farming environments, is that if you do have an issue somewhere in the supply chain with a food safety failure, it's very difficult to track it back, as opposed to tracking it back to a very small distributed environment. So you've got a very limited impact to the community and the supply chain at large.
And when you take a systems thinking approach to food, and you're dealing with technology, you have to start thinking about the unintended consequences of technology. And we've certainly seen the unintended consequences of pesticides blowing across fields. And we've now seen the unintended consequences of social media at scale and their impact on elections and the culture. And so I think with food, I'm always encouraging entrepreneurs to bring a mindset of broadened responsibility, and to think about being a steward rather than being a disruptor. I mean, the culture of Silicon Valley is sort of notoriously known for move fast and break things. And I think when you break things in a food system, you're going to cause a whole lot of pain to a lot of communities, cultural mores, people who are excluded, traditionally. So I think we have to bring really an ethos of care around food as innovators. And that's why I think I love what Eleanor's saying, and Kyra and Don, in that, I think it's more about like new ways of collaborating, new business structures. Maybe I think we need much more cooperative kinds of enterprises that are interdependent, and where incentives are aligned rather than misaligned like they are, just throughout the current food system. And, it gets kind of scary when you start thinking about people who want to bet, like on the things that Fred just said, like let's short the breadbasket in the Midwest, and let's buy the land up in Canada, and then let's just let the chips go where they may. And it's not beyond our capitalistic market to be thinking that way. And so again, that's not necessarily a mindset of care or inclusion or equity.
And you're teaching at a business school, yes?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm at UC Berkeley, where some people still question whether there should be a business school, but it is one of the best business schools in the country. And
the reason I ask is I think that I have in my own mind that if I were Shakespeare, I wouldn't say kill all the lawyers, I'd say kill all the MBAs. That we've gotten, again, it's a scale question. We've gotten into a world where you get a multiplicity of people who are trained to think in terms of efficiency. And
Yeah,
they
I mean, I
get
see
the
that.
blinders off.
I see that point of view, and I would say, you know, I am so heartened by the 42 MBA students in my class in the graduate seminar of Edible Ed that I'm just hoping how many more of these can I intersect with, because these will be the people that have the credentials that get hired into these big companies and are going to have to figure out how to steer them or take them apart and reconstruct them. I mean, that's my hope, is to really, it's a bit of a Trojan horse strategy of bringing, but it's work. You know, I've been at the university for 20 years, and the first students I started to teach went on to become like the head of sustainability at Hewlett Packard and the head of sustainability at Levi Strauss and the Gap and, you know, other big companies. And they like reworked a lot of the supply chains. They addressed human rights issues in the supply chains. There's a lot of progress.
Do they feel powerful within their own organizations, or do they feel decorative?
No, I mean, I think food is newer. You know, I mean, one of my students the other day was sort of lamenting the fact that, you know, she's going to work for a big CPG company and the only food she could get on was a salad dressing brand, at which the people on this call would not recognize as food. But it's a start, you know, and I think a lot of people, you know, I see a lot of people going into big food with ambitions to change the game. And we wrote a case study recently about General Mills and their 1 million acre commitment to source ingredients for their products from regeneratively farmed land. And
which is the upside of scale.
yeah, I mean, so it's crossing over. I would say, you know, in my research, it's people are not fully bought in. A lot of people say, well, those aren't for my brands. My consumer who eats those cereals sold at those big stores, they're not really interested in that. But those people who shop over here, they're certainly interested in it and they're willing to pay a little bit of a premium. So let's do it. So, I mean, but that's the way a big company justifies, you know, they usually make decisions for either fear of missing out or fear of being called out and being on the wrong side of an issue. So, you know, there's some great case histories like the Immokalee workers in Florida with tomatoes but you know, we're getting to the end here, but I was going to put in one resource that I really, you know, I mean, besides Marion's food politics blog, which comes out every week, which is, you know, a must. We rely on some of the work that Project Drawdown does that looks at the overall climate system and where the leverage points are to make a difference. And it turns out that I think 9 of the top 13 places where we can make a difference in reversing climate change or, you know, dramatically lowering carbon have to do with the food system. So that's a good resource. That they have a great website, projectdrawdown.org.
I would love to ask all of you if you have your go-to sites to share that. And then Fred, maybe when we send the follow-up to everybody, we could include that list. Because I think it is, to the question someone asked about how do we create more trust and transparency, you got to do your research. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Were there any other questions? I feel like we've covered so much here and you guys have been so deeply, deeply informed. I'm really, really grateful that you tolerated my naive questions and took them seriously and helped us explore some of these pockets. I'm not sure we got one single answer, but I think we'd all agree there isn't one single answer. And I really appreciate all the work that each of you is doing. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who's joined us. Fred, do you have any other thoughts or wrap ups? Oh, yes, you do. Of course you do.
I do, yes. So basically, I just want to make sure that I thank everyone for joining us and staying tuned. Thank our panelists as well for providing a tremendous dialogue, conversation among themselves as well as with us. I think we've all learned a lot. There's a lot to learn, which is great. I like Will's idea of training a fifth column to invade big food. Maybe it'll be analogous to what big oil is doing right now. They've seen the writing on the wall. They're now basically trying to pivot into renewable energy. Maybe we can get the same thing to happen with Will's shock troops in the bowels of ConAgra. Anyway, all delighted that you were able to join us. We do have another very interesting and timely webinar coming up in about a month, which is healthcare after the pandemic. And we're going to have some experts here, which are going to tell us what are the lessons we've learned. So we think that'll be very interesting as well. And we would encourage you to join us. Stay tuned. You can always go to our website to learn more. Basically now I'll stop the commercial and again, just thank our columnists, or panelists rather, for joining us, spending their time, their valuable time. Now get back to work and fix it. It needs to be fixed and you guys have to do it. So thank you,
all.
everyone.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Fred.
Really fantastic. We appreciate it.